Dr. Scott, thank you for being here with us today. We came together to talk about your work and your approach when it comes to the UFO topic. I know it's not proper to ask younger women for their age, but please tell me for how long you've been researching the UFO subject already.
Well, I had experiences when I was real young, but I didn't say anything about it for many, many, many years. And I sort of got into it in the 1990s. So I've been researching ever since about the 1980s. So I guess I've been quite a while, but I didn't really dive in too hard because I was working and I didn't want to look like I was a nutcase or anything.
Yeah. But let's jump in a little bit earlier. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit more about yourself. I find people's life stories very interesting. I can imagine that many listeners also find it exciting. I saw a beautiful picture of you in your Facebook profile. It shows you and your father. And you were still very young in that picture. You were standing next to a horse. Beautiful picture. Those were good times, weren't they?
We were really poor and we farmed with horses back then. And so it was a totally different world. But I actually remember it. It's not rosy for me. There's a lot of work involved and everything else.
Yeah.
We didn't have indoor plumbing or any of that fancy stuff that, today's world.
In another interview, I heard that you experienced something strange together with your sister when you were only 6 years old.
Yeah. At that time, we were very poor and we didn't have, like a television or anything. We had one radio and we'd never heard of UFOs or spacemen or rocket ships or anything. And so when this happened to us, it was years before we figured out what it was, but the whole family remembered it and lots of relatives too, because we were just terrified. My sister and I were sleeping in an attic room in the house, and it was an attic room that had walls that sloped up to the center and then had a center ceiling about 3 feet. She was on one side of the room and I was on the other. We're not sure about our ages. She wasn't in school yet, and I don't remember whether I was or not. So we think we were around 6 or 4 or something. But we didn't know anything about UFOs or anything. So I woke up and there was this thing flying around the room. And I didn't have any idea what it was. It was dark and it was night and the light was off. It was just flying around the room. It came close to both of us. It was pretty small. And it was actually, nowadays, you'd call tic-tac objects. So it was like an actual tic-tac. I don't think they had them back then, you know what I mean. And it was flying around the room and it glowed. It sort of looked like hot iron. And after a while, I noticed that it seemed to know where it was going. I mean, it didn't just fly into a wall or anything. It would fly around the room, but it would avoid the furniture and go around the furniture and turn and not hit a wall and all that. And so I was real curious about what on earth this thing is. And it wasn't a lightning bug or anything like that. It wasn't blinking. And it just looked like hot metal. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. After it came kind of close to us several times. And then it flew up to the ceiling, but it turned before it got to the ceiling. And it flew along the ceiling and it came to the chandelier, which was turned off. It came to the chandelier and started circling and circling and circling and circling and circling. The wall was, maybe about a foot or so from the chandelier, and it didn't feel its way around or anything. It kind of knew where the chandelier was and where the wall was. And it didn't hit anything. It just circled the chandelier. And then it came down in a spiral. Then it's right about the end of the spiral. I just became absolutely terrified. So terrified you just couldn't believe it. And started running out of the room. And my sister and I both started screaming. So the same thing happened to her. And we were so terrified, we fell down the stair steps. And then we couldn't get the door open. We were lunging toward the door. And finally we got the door open and ran to our parents screaming and everything. And so they told us that, we were lying. And Dad told us to go back upstairs and threatened to beat us up. And we didn't go. And finally he went up and said, everything's all right. And we reluctantly went back upstairs. later we found out about lightning bolts, but this thing seemed to know where things were. It didn't just float around at random, and it didn't go with the wind or anything. There wasn't a wind. When it circled, it just, the wind wasn't blowing it. And we have no idea how it got in the room. There wasn't a storm going on. We know that. So I was just so terrified you couldn't believe it. But it was many, many, many years later, I read a book by Jenny Randles called, I forget the name of it, but it was about kids that see UFOs when they're young, and then they have repeater experiences later. Usually that happens to one person, but it happened to my sister and I together. And so we're about the only people that, have a witness on both the young experience and the old experience. But I didn't know what UFOs were then. And even later, we thought of UFOs as like airplanes or something, not things flying around your room. But in her book, she talked about bedroom experiences of kids, that they will see little things like little UFOs in their bedroom or something. And then when they get older, they have more like regular UFO experiences. And that happened to both of us together, so that we were pretty unusual. But it was years before we even figured out it had anything to do with UFOs.
Yeah.
And you said it's like a ball of like hot iron?
That's what it looked like.
What do you think it'd be, like a size, like a golf ball? Or
No, it was tiny. I mean, I remember it as tiny. I think she remembers it as larger, but that was years and years ago. I just remember it as tiny, like a Tic Tac, actually.
Oh yeah,
maybe
okay.
an inch long and sort of shaped like a cough drop.
Sure.
But it was glowing, and the outside of the glow would have been larger.
I thought about ball lightning or something like that too, but you already said it wasn't.
There wasn't any storm going on, because when there were storms, we had this old house, and my mother would make us come downstairs if there was a storm. And she didn't make us come downstairs, so I know there wasn't a storm, and we all remember good weather, so I don't think it had anything to do with it.
Did you hear any sound coming from that thing?
I thought I did just about the time it disappeared. I thought I heard a sound, but my sister didn't hear anything, so I don't know.
Was the paranormal, or perhaps the idea of extraterrestrial life, also a topic in your family during your childhood? Did your parents or grandparents maybe tell you stories about ghosts or other strange happenings?
No, they were very conservative, and they didn't talk about things like that. And that if they had thought that thing we saw was a UFO, we wouldn't have been allowed to say anything about it either. People just didn't talk about that, and people thought you were crazy, so they said, don't talk about it.
Oh, okay.
So we didn't have discussions. Later, when I was much older, I did find out family stories about UFOs, and then people talk about it a little more, but they didn't when we were young. I mean, I had a cousin that lived several miles away. He said one landed in his yard and his electricity went off. But it's something we found out about later, because they didn't talk about it at the time.
People are sometimes very scared to talk about it. I had a UFO sighting myself when I was 16. I'm 42 now. In the beginning, it wasn't easy to talk about it, because people tend to laugh about you when you have stories like that. It's sad.
I know, you get harassed, and the government has had a big part in that by saying no such thing. When people see it, they know something is there.
And since you have a background in science, I can imagine that it wasn't easy for you to come forward with your interest in the topic and your work on the UFO topic, right?
No, I kept quiet for a very long time, and I didn't read or anything about UFOs, although it was in the back of my mind. And then later, as I approached retirement, I got a little more interested, and then finally I started writing books.
You've written a few books on the subject. Has writing always been a passion of yours?
No, it was a passion of my mother's. I was in science, and I hated writing, and I'd write letters to my mother, and it would come back red, and she'd correct all my English in red pencil and everything. It was like a bloody piece of paper. And then later, after she died, well, I started writing too, and so I'm sorry I didn't let her know that she influenced me.
Maybe she knows.
Well, maybe she does.
One of your book titles is called UFOs Today, 70 Years of Lies, misinformation and government cover-up. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about this book? Oh, there, you got it.
It was kind of chronological, and it told about, it started about the beginning of UFOs and went forward until today. I was published in 2017, so that's pretty close to today. I started out with Kenneth Arnold, and the reason he was probably what initiated the idea of UFOs as flying objects, as like possible spaceships with entities in them and things like that. I started out with that because I'd been in a thrift store looking at books, and there were all these fancy books that you could buy for nothing that were really expensive books. And I was looking at them, and I found this really boring looking book. And I thought, well, maybe I should look at the boring books too. And so I pulled it out, and it turned out to be the book by Kenneth Arnold. And so I thought, oh, this is boring. But I just kept, my hand just kept grasping it. And finally I bought it and I brought it home. And it was really a totally fascinating book. I guess people don't read it, but I was reading it, years and years and years after 1947 when it happened to him, and interpreting it in today's world. And it was just fascinating because it was just like somebody was playing a hoax on him, or maybe aliens were. And he just had told his raw experiences. And at that time, probably people didn't believe some of the things. He was a really good pilot, and he was flying by Mount Adams and Mount Hood, I think, in his airplane. And he knew where the mountains were, how far apart they were and everything. He was just an excellent pilot. And he saw these 5 objects. And he was real intelligent, and so he knew where these mountains were and how far away they were, and he timed, how fast they went from one mountain to the other, and got a speed on them, and got a good look at them and things like that. And then he reported it, and that was actually the first report of what people think of as UFOs now, because before, nobody was aware of like spaceships and things, that there might be spaceships here. And then he had all these weird experiences. He was very well, he had really good credentials, so people believed him to start with about the UFOs, but then he had all these other things happen to him that made no sense then, but they would now. This man asked him to investigate these other UFO sightings. There had been a plane crash by Mount Rainier. I said Mount Hood, and I meant Mount Rainier. He did rescue missions and things like that with his airplane. He had a real difficult to fly airplane from back then. The person was Ray Palmer, and he was a science fiction writer. But Arnold didn't know anything about him. He said if he'd known he was a science fiction writer, he probably wouldn't have taken the assignment. But this man wanted him to investigate this crash and possible sighting. So he took off in his plane one day and went to Tacoma, Washington. And he didn't tell anybody where he was going or anything. He didn't file flight plan or anything. And he landed, and he couldn't find a hotel room. Everything was crowded. And so finally, just for something to do, he called the most expensive hotel in town. He found out there was a room reserved in his name. And so he assumed that somebody else with the same name had reserved it, but he took the room. And then he was to talk to this man. These 2 men had reported that it was called the Murray Island, usually called hoax. And these 2 men said that one of them, named Dow, had been on a boat with his son and his dog, and they'd seen this donut-shaped UFO by Murray Island. And this thing had dropped fragments on him. And I think it killed his dog and injured his son or something. And so then his supervisor went out and said, oh yeah, he saw fragments too. His supervisor was named Chrisman. Well, Ray Palmer wanted him to investigate that. And in the meantime, right after he had made the sighting, he thought it was important that the government should know about this. And so he contacted the government two people, Brown and Davidson from the government, contacted him and interviewed him, and they took him seriously and were polite to him. And Brown had told him if he found out anything else to call him at his office. I think their office was in California, maybe Edwards Air Force Base. But he had also written to Wright-Patterson, which was the Air Force head. And Wright-Patterson didn't write back for a long time. And he had had his sighting. He wrote to them. Roswell had happened, but nobody knew about it. And then finally, a long time later, well, Wright-Patterson wrote back to him. And he thought that was kind of ridiculous because he thought these could be missiles, and he interpreted them as missiles or foreign, from another country. And he thought the government should be interested. And the government had this really strange reaction of just ignoring it. So anyway, in the meantime, Ray Palmer had asked him to investigate the Murray Island thing. And he went to this hotel in Tacoma, and he looked in the phone directory and found the name of Dahl, the man that said he had had this experience. And he contacted him by the phone. Well, when he talked to Dow just warned him away and said, "This is bad business, stay away, everything, you don't want anything to do with this." And one reason he was looking about it was due to a plane crash. Well, Dow finally started talking to him and said that he had this man that came and talked to him and that knew all about the sighting, even though nobody else had been there, told him all about the sighting and told him to stay away and stay out of this. And that, just to start with, it was a real, in today's world, it was a very funny thing because it was like Men in Black. I mean, that's what Men in Black do, but this was way back in 1947, and Men in Black was about the 1960s. And so that seems strange to start with. And then he was being interviewed by somebody on the radio, but the radio person was getting messages about everything that he did. They didn't know why. And they looked for a bug in the hotel room. I mean, obviously in today's world, you'd think of a bug because the hotel had been reserved in his name, and somebody had done that, even though they didn't know he was coming there, like the government or somebody was really spying on him. And so anyway, they checked for bugs. He talked to a pilot who was an airline pilot, and he had seen the 9 objects too. So Arnold had contacted him, and they were both together investigating. The airplane pilot had seen it, his co-pilot had seen it, and the other people in the aircraft had seen the 9 objects flying around that area. So he and Smith, the pilot, began investigating, and they met Dow and Chrisman, and Dow and Chrisman showed him these co-workers and things like they were real. They were telling people they were harbor patrolmen, which I think they weren't, but they were in a hoax. But it's always written up as just a hoax by these 2 people, Dow and Chrisman. It sounded like there were a lot more people in the hoax. I mean, somebody reserved a hotel for him, which cost a lot of money, and apparently bugged it. And they looked all over for a bug, and they called it a dictaphone back then. I think it was a big thing that you had to plug in, but somebody was obviously listening to him, and it must have been a lot more elaborate bug than what they knew anything about. He had another sighting of UFOs, and this was small UFOs that looked just like the big ones, but there were about 30 of them in a cluster of them. This was why it was flying, and he didn't get a picture of them. Then he was trying to figure out what was going on, and he called Brown, who was the government person that talked to him. And Brown and his friend Davidson said they'd fly up to, Tacoma and see him and help investigate. So they came in an airplane, and for some reason, they had the airplane monitored, or what do you call it, guarded. And nobody knew why, but so Brown and Davidson talked to Chrisman and Dow, and they didn't believe him. So they were heading back, but Dow insisted on giving them the fragments. And then also about the fragments, Dow had invited Arnold to visit his house, his secretary's house, not his house. He would show him the fragments. Well, Arnold visited his house, his secretary's house. The secretary was there it looked like everything looked normal. She was there at her kitchen table going over through receipts. They had a piano, everything just looked like a normal house. And Dow showed him these fragments from the UFO that had fallen down. Arnold was real smart, and he said, Dow said something about being radioactive. So he said he set his camera down beside him, and he thought if they were radioactive, it would fog the film. And he found out later that the film wasn't fogged, that it wasn't radioactive. But the next day, he and Smith decided to go look for that house, and they found it. But the house was like nobody had been there for like years. It had cobwebs all over the door. It was just like a totally deserted house that you couldn't even get into. And so he was just totally perplexed by that. But in today's world, you might see that as an abduction experience, which I wrote about in the book. That's just like, an abduction experience and screen memories and things that people have today. And so, his was getting bad. And then he was supposed to load the fragments into the airplane of Brown and Davidson and the box of fragments. He said the box of fragments that he loaded in didn't look anything like like Brown had showed him in this secretary's house, which is weird. And he said it was really heavy. And he loaded the box of fragments in the airplane, even though the two men didn't want them. Then the two government men took off, and their plane exploded, and they both died. And this informant that kept telling the radio station about what was going on in Arnold's room told the radio station that, well, they had fragments from the UFO and the government had killed him or something because it's dangerous to investigate UFOs. Then Arnold was traveling home. He stopped at an airport to refuel and took off, and his engine died immediately. And the only thing that saved him was he was just an excellent pilot, and he managed to land. But he said the only way the engine could have died would be if he had turned off the gas. And so he thought he was under mind control, and he went back home. He was pretty well respected, but everybody, with these other things, people would call him crazy too. But in today's world, that's something that happens to UFO people. But it didn't back then, and so it caused him to not have credibility. And I've talked to his daughter, who said, yeah, that was the whole thing was really rough on the family, and they weren't making money on it or anything. But that was in the book. I started out that because it just was so weird, and it was so much like the things that happen to people today.
It's quite a story.
I actually remember that case. That's awesome that you got into that and writing about that case. Yeah, I remember I guess the guy was on his boat when a few UFOs came up above him, and one of them was having problems with like fire and smoke, and then it exploded where like fragments did come from it, and it killed his dog. And the men in black did end up showing up shortly after he was trying to contact the government. No, I do remember that case pretty well. That's awesome. To hear more in depth about that story.
Well, it's like they always presented it as just a hoax by these two men, but it sounded like a much more complicated hoax than that to me.
I find the title of the book very appropriate because I also think that we are told many lies when it comes to UFOs. I remember the UFO hearing in the Congress not too long ago, where they showed pictures and like little video clips from UFO stuff. And I was thinking, the only thing good about it is that it finally is presented to the public. They say, hey, there is something that we don't know what it is, and maybe if there's somebody inside, or we don't know what it is and where it comes from. That's the only good thing. But what they presented to the public was literally nothing. What are your thoughts about it?
Well, that's why I started out the book that way, was because I thought there was some there was a lot of suggestion that the government knew something was going on way back then.
Yeah.
And then also that's the time Roswell happened. And so I thought there'd been a cover-up for a very long time from the government. Also, I mean, that was when Roswell, and that didn't make the news until later. Everybody thinks it was cover-up there. So I was just suggesting that there'd been a cover-up for maybe, and a very advanced cover-up too, for quite a few years, and it stuck. Maybe the government knew something about it before Roswell and before Kenneth Arnold.
I would like to know more about some UFO cases that you have dealt with. Which ones were particularly most important for you?
Well, there's been quite a number. One of them was one in the 1990s where it was in Ohio, and it was about 2 or 3 hours from where I live. This family they were living kind of in the country, and there was a cornfield, and they saw these lights that were these, you might call them orbs, that were flying around the cornfield, red lights. And they wondered what they were, and they reported to all kinds of people. They reported it to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. They reported it to the TV. They reported it to the radio, the police, and everything else. And the thing, usually when you see a UFO, it just disappears, and you don't get time to do anything. Well, these things stayed. The police came out, and the police looked at it. They were the authorities and everything. And the police said, well, they don't know what they are, and left. So they had been investigated by authorities. They said that then there was an airplane that sort of flew over the whole performance in a grid pattern. One of the objects flew up and kind of followed the airplane for a while and came back down. And they had no idea where the airplane came from, but they had, notified airports and everything else. And it was on TV. They reported it, that there was something going on. And then one of the objects came down and followed a car, and it came close to the house. And then there was this real strange noise, that kind of like a deer, but not quite. And then the thing flew back away. And so they watched it for a long time, and they had time to report it and everything. And so that was a really good UFO sighting. Another person and I went out to investigate later and talked to him in the daytime. At night afterwards, they had another sighting of the round things, but we didn't stay long enough, so we missed it. But it was a really good sighting because it had all kinds of elements. I mean, there were a lot of witnesses. The things stayed around. They reported it everywhere. The authorities came out, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And so it was, it took several hours, and it was a really good sighting with a lot of witnesses and that sort of thing. It wasn't just, will-o-wisp or whatever you'd call it. And the people seemed intelligent and not, nutty or anything.
Yeah, very interesting. Not too long ago, there was this case about this guy named Andrew Dawson. Have you heard about it? He uploaded a video on the platform TikTok where he claimed to have filmed a giant on a hill in Canada. They call it giant. It looks somewhat strange, but he said it could be a giant. And then he came back a few days later to try to find it again. And he filmed this UFO in the sky. It was almost the same spot where he might have seen this giant, but on the same spot in the air, he filmed this crazy looking UFO. I have videos. I can send them to you if you want to have a look at it. It was an interesting case because he tried to investigate a little bit. This guy is not a UFO investigator. He's a random guy. And then he tried to do a little bit of research, and he came back to the hill, and he went into the woods and tried to go by foot to the spot. And there was this CIA agent that told him, you have to go back. Don't come near this area again. And we can't have you here. And then he was observed. There was black cars standing in front of his apartment. And when he went outside to confront this guy in the car, he drove away very quickly. Every time he went back to the hill, there was an agent or police or something like that and told him, you can't come near here anymore. We don't want you here. And it was crazy. And the end of the story is this guy made another video on TikTok where he acted very nervous, and he told the people it was all a lie, it was all a hoax, and all these videos are fake, and I did this just for fun. But he acted very nervous in this video, and he was looking around as if there was somebody standing besides him. Yeah, end of the story is this guy died. He's dead.
Oh.
Now he's dead. There's still people around that say it was all a hoax and he faked his death, but you can't find the death notice in the newspaper. So we can assume he really died, and nobody knows how he died or why. Strange case.
Well, did he leave information on where the mountain was, or wherever he saw the thing, so that other people can go?
Yeah, those videos are still around. You can watch them everywhere. I can send some of them to you if you want to have a look at it. And you can also see the strange being on the hill, and you can see the UFO in the sky. It's impressive. The being is not very impressive to me. I don't know what it was, but the UFO in the sky, there's strange lights. It looks very impressive to me, and I will send you the videos. And this case is very interesting, even though people say it's fake, but they always say it's fake. It's always fake. Of course it's fake. It has to be fake. This guy made it for fame or whatnot, but he disappeared and now he's dead. I don't know. Strange. Very strange.
That was like the Arnold case where all these people were dying.
I have this podcast in German too, and I speak to a lot of people who have seen UFOs, and I also spoke to people from America, from England, and there's a few reports of people that told me after they seen UFOs and put them on their YouTube channels, maybe just for fun, the police came by and said, hey, we want your videos, we want your pictures, or why have you been there? Are you planning on going there again? Stuff like that, asking random questions, strange questions. And I think they try to intimidate these people, that they stay away from this topic. Strange.
Yeah. Well, I think there was just a recent researcher that had a website about Area 51, and he recently just got ransacked by the CIA and others. Just took his papers and computers and didn't give him any tickets, didn't arrest him, but just kind of shows that, yeah, something is cooking underneath the grounds of Area 51.
I think Area 51 is still very interesting. Is it for you also?
Well, my husband used to work there a number of years ago, and I moved to Nevada because he had worked at Area 51, and then he wasn't working there then, but he was still working in Nevada. And he told me all about Area 51, and I'd never heard of Area 51, and I didn't pay attention to him. I just thought, and then later, after he died, well, I found out a lot more about Area 51. I have all kinds of questions that I should have asked him back then.
But he never told you something strange about Area 51, right?
Well, he told me it was all underground, but there were a lot of questions I should have asked him that I didn't ask, that, now I would, but it's a little too late. Yeah, I mean, it was real secretive, and he lived in Mercury, Nevada, and they bussed him to the test site. He worked at the test site too, in Area 51, and he said everything was underground and all that, but I'd never asked him anything in particular.
What was his job at Area 51? What did he do?
I'm not too sure. He was in the Air Force, and I just don't remember. I should have asked him a lot more detail.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Did he tell you at one point that he isn't allowed to talk to you or stuff like that, or?
No, but I didn't ask him any real detailed questions either.
Okay,
so
maybe he assumed you're not interested anyways. So,
well, I am now. He had a Q clearance, so he had a clearance that that was a fairly high clearance. I think it was a atomic energy clearance, and he worked on the test site too.
And we have Bob Lazar coming out of Area 51 too, with all the whistleblowing that he's been doing.
That's when people found out about Area 51, was I think from him and George Knapp in Nevada. Mm-hmm. But John had told me about that before, and I didn't pay attention because I just didn't know anything about it, which is stupid. And he had driven me around and things. And now I would really pay attention, but way back then I just didn't was oblivious to everything. Missed my chance to find out things.
But your husband never was in contact with, let's say, Bob Lazar or other big players from Area 51, right?
No, he didn't. I didn't ever ask him that much detail, and I think Bob Lazar would have been working after he was there anyway.
Yeah. I used to read a lot about abduction cases. A few years ago, people reported that they were abducted by aliens, and that at that time, few years back, the topic made me laugh a little bit rather than think. But now it's different. When I studied the subject more intensively, I realized that there are many similarities. People from different countries talk about the same experiences. They describe the same circumstances and the same things. They describe what the inside of the objects looked like and what happened to them inside. And also there are many similarities. And then I realized that there must be something to these stories. What do you think about these abduction cases? Have you worked on many abduction cases? Have you talked to a lot of people who claim to be abducted, stuff like that?
Well, my last book, Beyond Pascagoula, is about two people that were abducted. And the next book I'm writing is with Philip Mantle, and that's about the same abduction. That was a Pascagoula abduction. And we've investigated that. It was happened in 1973, which was a long time ago, but it's just amazing how much information there is. And we just kind of, I mean, he keeps asking for information, information keeps coming in and new things. This was an abduction of two people that were shipyard employees. One was an older man and the other was a younger. The younger was a teenager, and the older man had been in the military, and they were family friends. I mean, he was friends with the younger guy's father, and his son was friends with his son and all that, but they were working together, and they didn't have any interest in UFOs. And apparently the older man had told his son that he didn't think they existed and everything. So anyway, they went out fishing on a pier. The younger man was kind of nervous because he had a new car and he'd parked it some distance away, and it was sort of trashy and grown up, and they had to walk through things to get to and I think there was a no trespassing sign and everything. So he was nervous. So this blue light appeared, and they both thought it was the police. And the younger man was going to say, well, it's his fault. He thought he brought us out there and everything. Don't blame me and everything. But anyway, it turned out to be a lot worse than that, because it was a UFO. And neither of them even believed in UFOs. And the thing came, and they couldn't run or anything because they were out on a pier. And then it was just like it opened, it got real bright, and a door opened. And just like they were paralyzed and they couldn't get away. And these things came out and grabbed them and took him into the object. What they mainly remember is sort of being scanned and things, but they were just absolutely terrified beyond anything you could believe. And I guess things just, it was really bright and you couldn't see anything inside much, but these things came out of the wall, and it was like they scanned them. And then they put them back. Then the object disappeared. Afterwards, they were down on the ground and everything. And, you know, the younger man finally sort of came to, and he just stood there with his arms up, and then he fell over. It was just a really traumatic experience, like, you know, being captured by a lion or something. So then the younger man, he had his life ahead of him, and he didn't want to talk about it because, you know, everybody'd call him crazy for the rest of his life. But the older man had been in the military, and he thought he could hold up to all the nastiness that would happen to him, and he wanted to report it. So finally that night he reported it. He had trouble reporting it too, because he tried calling the airport and the Kessler Air Force Base, and they said, well, the UFOs don't exist. The Air Force has nothing to do with them. And he tried, I think, the newspaper, and it was closed. And finally they told him to go to the police. The younger man just told people he became unconscious and fainted, and he didn't remember anything because he didn't want to talk about it. but they went to the police, and the police interviewed him separately and then together. And then they left him in a room by themselves. They had a tape recorder hidden, and the police, didn't want to get hoaxed. And so they had the tape recorder in there so that to find out if they were hoaxing, because, if they were hoaxing, they'd laugh and say, well, we really, took them in. But instead, the two men were just absolutely terrified and praying to God and everything else you can think of. They were so terrified. And so the police then believed them, even though it was hard-nosed policemen. And so it made international headlines all over the world because, for one thing, people don't report things like that. I mean, if you're abducted, you don't want to say anything about it because everybody tell you you're lying. And then a lot of people don't remember it, like the Betty and Barney Hill thing. They didn't even remember anything that came out in hypnosis and things. So they may not know about it, or know about it years later. But these people, it was conscious. They reported immediately, which was something totally different. They weren't believers or had no interest in UFOs. So it made the headlines all over the world.
Very interesting case. I know about this case, and Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson. It's the name of the two guys. And I actually had the chance to talk to Calvin Parker not too long ago. He was very sick already when we talked. Unfortunately, he's very sick, and I wish him all the best. He's a great guy, a humble guy, and I enjoyed a lot talking to him. I'm very thankful that he took the time to talk to me because he was already, like I said, very sick, and his tongue was swollen.
Oh,
from the treatments and stuff. It was not easy to talk at this point, but he took the time to talk to me for like an hour or something. Maybe I can send you the video or put this under this video.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, like you said it earlier, that more and more informations are coming in from this case, more and more informations. And this is crazy that even if it was 1973, think about it, and still informations are coming in. And I also had the chance to talk to Philip Mantle. I had a podcast with Philip Mantle also. He's a great guy, and your book will be published by Philip, right?
This last one was by Philip, and then the next one, we're both co-authors of it.
Yeah. That's interesting. Looking forward. Will be a great read, I'm sure. Yeah, the Pascagoula case is very interesting also for me. I'm always sucking in those informations.
I was going to say, that's one of my favorite cases too. I actually have a bunch of autographs from Calvin Parker and some of the sketches that he actually drew himself.
I sure wish he was in better shape.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah, of course. But when I talked to him, I had a very good feeling, and he's very believable. He's a humble guy. There's no reason for him to lie. I mean, with a story such as this, you can ruin your whole life. Easy. You can ruin your life if you tell a story for so many decades, and he's stuck to this story. You can imagine you have problems with employers or friends or family, and people, they turn their backs on you because you are the crazy UFO guy, abducted from aliens and stuff like that. But he's sticking to his story, and this is great. This is really great, and this makes him very believable in my eyes. And I talked to him, and I'm not a psychologist or something like that, but when you talk to this guy, you have a good feeling, and you get the feeling that the story is really true. So great.
And it reminds me of a lot about Travis Walton too. And that case is pretty amazing. The other 5 or 6 witnesses that saw him get zapped by that beam of light, and then they drive off and come back and he's gone, and they went to the police right away, and the police thought that these guys murdered him and came up with this bizarre story that an alien took him. And then there was like a mad search for him. I think that's like a 200-man hunt, searching through the woods, and they couldn't find him for, I guess, 5 days later. He just pops up into a gas station or a phone booth, and he calls his brother to come pick him up. And then they found him naked, screaming, like terrified. Yeah, and then all these guys had to go through lie detector tests, and they all passed with flying colors. So that one's another eerie one too. That movie. I don't know if you guys seen the movie Fire in the Sky. I'm pretty sure you guys have. No, Daniel. You
Yeah, I
get on
met him, and he seemed honest to me. So
that.
there were a lot of witnesses on the Pascagoula one too. Just we're
Yeah.
finding zillions of witnesses
Yeah.
that saw something.
Yeah.
And another interesting case, which I'm sure you know about, Dr. Scott, is the Ruwa, Zimbabwe case, where those kids at the kindergarten, no, not the kindergarten, at the aerial school in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, saw those UFOs coming down, those beings reaching out to them, talking to them telepathically. And I actually had the chance to talk to one of those witnesses, and his name is Francis. And I met him at a convention, let's call it UFO convention here in Germany, in Frankfurt in Germany. And he came there to speak, talk about his story. And after the convention, we went out, had a few drinks, and he told me his story. And he also is very believable. And he himself, he has nothing to do with the UFO topic besides his story, of course. He's a little bit interested, but he's not deep into it, which makes him, in my eyes, even more believable. It was great to talk to him, and he told me his story. He told me what happened. You look these guys in the eyes, and you know it's true. Somehow you know it's true. These are not the eyes of a liar or the story of a liar. He told me this great, exciting story of what happened, and I was blown away by what he said. It's crazy. And also, like I said, this is also an interesting, very well-known case. What can we expect from you in the next few months, maybe? You talked about another book that is coming out. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your new book, a little bit more information about your new book?
Yeah, two of them. One of them is called Beyond a Doubt with Philip Mantle. I can get it and show it to you if you want to see what it looks like. It's called Beyond Reasonable Doubt. I don't know if you can see it. What we're saying is that it's the Pascagoula abduction. There's so much information that in a court case, it'd be accepted that that happened. I mean, there were a lot of other witnesses, including witnesses that were abducted the same time as they were abducted. And so and a lot of witnesses saw this thing. There was witnesses to the abduction, but they didn't know what was going on at the time. And so there were just, a whole lot of circumstantial evidence that something happened, unlike a usual abduction where it's out in the boondocks someplace and there's no other witnesses. Well, there are plenty of witnesses on that, and it took place sort of in a public area. And so we have just found tons and tons of other information. For example, when it happened, the police department had collected 50 reports of people that called in and said, hey, there's something, UFO here, called the police that same night that it happened. And then they had a lot of other reports that they just had too much to record. So there were a lot of people that saw everything. Unfortunately, a lot of that material, when Hurricane Katrina went through it, damaged it. But we found a lot of people that saw things. They're reporting them now because it's a lot more easy to come out in the open on it and say, yeah, I saw something.
Very interesting. We're looking forward for this book.
I have another one accepted that's called Aliens Armageddon, the meaning of alien messages. It's just accepted. I'm still working on it, though.
Okay, Dr. Scott, thank you for being with us today. And I very much enjoyed talking to you. It was very interesting. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, I've been working with some really interesting, great people like Philip Mantle and Calvin Parker and things that really have a lot of credibility. And so I'm very lucky. And thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Please stay with us for 2 more minutes, right?
Okay, yeah.